proposal.
Hello, everyone. I am Pamela Ferguson, Vice President of Investments here at CFAL, and along with my colleagues, Lashell White, Investments Manager, and Angelo Butler, Manager of Corporate Advisory. We are going to discuss a topic that we feel is very important to every Bahamian household and impact every corner of our society. We are going to look at how to take government policy to our own productivity and strengthen ourselves so that we can withstand shocks and come out stronger. See, resilience is not something we just talk about. It's what keeps us going. When hurricanes wreck our shores, when the cost of living increase that it puts a strain on Bahamian households, or when global recessions impact our economy, the ability to adapt and to endure is essential. Resilience is going through tough times and coming out stronger. So as we discuss this topic briefly, we want to encourage you to see resilience as not just government policy, but a shared responsibility with individuals and communities. Welcome, Lashell. Welcome, Angelo.
Thank you.
So let's get started. Normally, when we talk about resilience or economic resilience, we tend to focus on the numbers: GDP growth, foreign reserves, revenue numbers. But let's go beyond the numbers and let's discuss how everyday Bahamians show strength in shocks like what we experience in COVID-19 or inflation that's caused by effects outside of our economy. How do we bounce back when we experience these shocks?
Well, like you alluded to earlier, Pam, resilience is being able to adapt and recover from emergencies and unexpected events. And over the past few years, we have had several of those events. So we had Hurricane Dorian, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we also had to deal with high inflation. So those things really tested our ability. But I think for us as a people, it's important to maintain a resilient mindset. It's important for us to be creative. It's important for us to be self-reliant. And during those events, for example, in Hurricane Dorian, we all got together and donated to those who needed things. During the pandemic, which was just so shocking and unexpected, we've never gone through anything like that before. We were able to become creative. We grew gardens in our backyards when groceries were in short supply. We started baking our own bread and doing all of these things. When high inflation came to our shores, we budgeted and cut back where we needed to be. Bahamians started side hustles. They started their own business, their home businesses. And we quickly had to pivot during these things. Like, for example, we had to pivot using technology. Children had to log on to go to school. And so our resilience showed up in the fact that we were able to quickly pivot and adapt to these things, which I think is the cornerstone of resilience. And Bahamian people as a whole are known for making do. And I think that it wasn't easy, but we managed to get through it.
Yeah, can you? My mic is on. Yes. Okay. Humans have always adapted, and no matter what has happened, we've gotten to where we are today. And resilience will always relate to some sort of uncertainty, right? And us being in the financial industry, we tend to see a lot more uncertainty than, for example, the average person, right? Because we monitor around the world. There are things that happen in the world that you may never hear of that have an impact on the Bahamas, or whether it's government policy. But again, humans always will adapt and make changes, right? And I think inflation, for example, as you mentioned, is one of the greatest challenges for the world, right? I always look at, what things cost 20, 25 years ago. And if you told me 25 years ago it would cost X today, I would wonder how people are making it, right? And I think a lot of us have that question of how people are making it. And you hear the stories from your parents, and they had so many kids and they were able to make do with this. And I think one thing we've seen is there's a drastic shift in younger persons today, where it's like, okay, you went through that, but I'm not going to go through that, right? And so persons, for example, are having less kids, right? And then if you're on your own, you're a bit more resilient than if you have other mouths to feed. And of course, this has other implications, right? You see politicians in the papers now speaking about the birth rate. And I think Doug and Derek spoke about it as well. So if we can't fix things like inflation, people will become more resilient by making themselves less dependent on the things that they cannot control, right? And that spells a lot of problems for the world, things like social security, NIB, and so forth. So I think we're seeing people adapt and make it, and they get through, but it's causing a lot of social decay and social problems that governments will ultimately have to address in the future.
I think you mentioned it, the Shell mindset. I think one of the ways we can adapt and bounce back is we have to change our mindset. We live in a region where we are very vulnerable and we are prone to economic shocks. We talk about hurricanes when they hit our shores. A research came out that says over $1 billion we spend on food imports. And so we are very vulnerable because most of our food supplies are imported. But there are opportunities in our vulnerability. So for instance, with our vulnerability with importing food, the opportunity is local agriculture. We are to be encouraged to plant a little, to reduce that food bill, and that will reduce as well over time our reliance on foreign currencies. Energy costs is a problem in this country. I know there have been a lot of talks, and we're going to hear from Angelo later on the projects that CFAL was involved in, but it's a reality. Energy cost is very high in our country. That's a vulnerability for us. But then the opportunity is solar. We should be encouraged with government policy and infrastructure development for Bahamians to take advantage of a natural resource, which is a solar. So there are vulnerabilities that we experience, but then there are also opportunities. We look at tourism, right? That's the largest industry, and that's where we get most of our foreign currency earnings. And we are vulnerable, and we saw that in COVID. After COVID, our borders were shut down. But then the opportunity is to encourage more of our young people to get into the digital space, or to get into creative industries where we can still earn foreign currency dollars without having to leave the country. And I think that is fitting because our youth unemployment rate is very high. So yes, we have vulnerabilities, but then there are also opportunities for us to become even more resilient.
And just to add, the Bahamas, I think we take for granted sometimes how resilient the country itself is. We don't have a parent like some of, like a Turks and Caicos or Cayman Islands, who we sometimes compare ourselves to. But if you look at us in the region, for a country that has dealt with, natural disasters on that scale, COVID-19 the pandemic, we've never defaulted on our debt, and we've never been in an IMF program, right? So we have to kind of give ourselves some credit. We've been resilient, but at the same time, we can't take that for granted, because we're seeing where those things accumulate over time and make us, particularly on a macro or government level, less resilient for future crises.
I mentioned tourism, and there's been a lot of conversation over the years on whether we should diversify within the tourism sector or away from the tourism sector. So, but no matter the argument, as we rely less on tourism, what impact does government policies like borrowing and taxes and subsidy support programs have on the citizenry? And can we really experience true resilience without the involvement of the Bahamian people?
Well, I think on the tourism side, one of the reasons we have always gravitated to tourism and are so dependent on it is that dependence on foreign reserves, right? And the Bahamian dollar is pegged to the US based on the amount of foreign reserves that we have. So anything we try to do outside of tourism, it either has to earn us US dollar revenue or cut the amount of revenue, US dollars, that we use to purchase, right? And I think it's difficult to find something like that because it has to be something you can sell on the international market, or in the case of agriculture, like farm and use locally. But like you said, resilience within tourism, we've seen some of it, and it's a problematic debate on whether cruise passengers are good for the economy or not, compared to stopovers. But at the same time, the cruise sector is a bit more resilient and recession-proof than stopovers, right? So we do have some resilience built into there. I think we just have to find ways to extract more from it, right? If 30 years ago, someone told you 12 million tourists would come to the Bahamas in 2025, I think anyone would sign up for that, right? And we have to continue to use things like the Tourism Development Corporation to incentivize small businesses and allow more of the money to trickle down into Bahamians' pockets directly, rather than, like a Bahama where it goes out of. But in terms of diversifying as well, I think we have to look at new innovative industries. A simple, for example, right, during the pandemic, I was just home, and there was a part of my yard where grass wasn't growing, and there was a part where it was growing good. And I dug up some of the grass from the good growing part, put it to the part that it didn't, and the other one grew right back. And every time I see, pallets of grass being imported into the Bahamas, I'm like, why are we importing grass, right? Grass is hurricane-proof, it's recession-proof. All you need is really a large area of land. And so it's things like that where because we have the strong tourism inflows, it just makes us so prone to the convenience of importing, but we have to look at that. Even things like timber and lumber, right? All you need is large swaths of land to grow trees, and it's not an overnight thing, right? But if you start planting trees today and you plant every year, in 20, 30 years, you could potentially have a lumber industry, right? And we need lumber because every time a hurricane comes, it blows our roofs off, right? So I think that's how we could kind of build resilience in other sectors, while at the same time supporting tourism.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Angelo said, to make our economy resilient beyond tourism, and we just have to be honest, tourism isn't going to go away anytime soon until we can diversify our economy. And so we have other areas that we can focus on. We can focus on agriculture to perhaps cut our food bills so we're not so reliant on that foreign currency reserves. We can look at improving technology, and we really have to open up the economy. And when I say open up the economy, I'm not talking about letting foreigners in, which seems pretty easy for us to do, but I'm saying to let Bahamians explore and expand, and we can't be afraid to do that. The world is a large place, so we have to open up and to bring more value and to allow persons to be creative, because Bahamians have great ideas, but they just need the support. So we need more programs. We need to expand vocational training to fill any gaps that outside of tourism. So we have institutions like BTVI, we have BAMSI, and they've laid sort of the groundwork for us doing these things, but we need to see more funding in these areas in order, if we're going to propel ourselves forward.
Tourism is our number one industry. It has been that way for years, and I don't think, like you said, Lashell, is going to change. But there needs to be some work to diversify within that industry. Yes, we had 11.2 million tourists that came to our shores last year. Only 1.7 million plus of those tourists were stopover, the more lucrative business. The rest of it is at the cruise port. And I know we have our friend Mike Mora here, so he's excited about that. But we need to find ways in which to increase the spend from our cruise ship passengers. It can't just be about the tax per head. The cruise port is doing phenomenal. All of the stores at the cruise port are local stores, which is a good thing. So that's more money in the pockets of Bahamian. But what happens when you get outside of the cruise port? What needs to be done? More needs to be done to assist with developing Bahamian businesses in order for some of that money that it lies in the cruise ship passengers to be spent on land. I read an article a few years ago, and they said the thing that really propelled the Swiss banking system was the legislators and the officials said to the industry specialists, go out there and create products. Just go out there and you just create and develop and innovate products. And we will follow with the right legislation and make sure that you are operating in accordance to international best practices. And so I think that's what we need. Tourism should be from the ground up, not the top down. From the top down with government and the officials or the tourism corporation, most of those persons are owners of hotels. So they're going to cater to their segment of the market, which are the stopover tourists. And if you only have 1.7 million thereabouts stopover tourists, but these people are setting the policy for the entire industry, you could see where we'll have challenges. So I think it needs to be something from the ground up, where government encourage businesses to go out there and create experiences and follow with the legislation to ensure that our tourists are always safe and to ensure that we are operating in accordance with best practice internationally so that we could reap more from the tourism product. And it's all integrated, because if we don't get sufficient revenue from the tourist dollars, that means the government then has to borrow more in order to sustain our economy. I was looking at some numbers in preparation for this presentation, and I look back at 2000. In 2000, our national debt was $98+ million. Today, the national debt is $12+ billion. And the problem with that is monies that can be allocated to education and healthcare and infrastructure development has to go towards interest expense. And if you look at the numbers, our interest cost is about $615+ million. That's double the amount that we pay in education, in healthcare, and in capital expenditure project. So it's very important for us to get the fiscal position of this country sorted out. And the government, with policy alone, cannot do it without the Bahamian people.
Yeah, I agree, Pam. Not all borrowing is bad, but when we borrow, it has to be productive and it has to be targeted. And I think that you mentioned that we pay so much in interest costs, and this takes away from basically the three pillars of our economy: education, healthcare, national security. And we see in these areas that productivity is low because the funding in these areas is lacking. And while we do need to grow things from the bottom up, I think that the government has to implement policies from the top down to make Bahamians feel confident that they have a part to play in this economy. Because if we don't feel like we have a part to play in this economy, then we won't engage, we won't care.
Just wanted to give some opportunity if anyone in the audience had any questions.
Go to the third question.
Okay.
Question. So you mentioned about the national debt, 12+ billion, right? And how do we deal with that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? But isn't it also true that a lot of the pension funds, individual investors, hold that national debt? So, which means that pensioners rely on that interest. What happens if you get rid of that national debt? Then what happens to, what's the replacement for the pensioners?
Well, I don't think in any country you'll ever see a government pay off all its debt, right? But and about 50% of the debt is foreign debt. So that portion goes to some Bahamians do hold some of the foreign debt, but it's a relatively low percentage, right? It's owed to like the IMF, multinationals, and then hedge funds, pension funds abroad. So if we can get rid of that component of debt, there's no net effect. Like you mentioned, local debt is not always bad. I think Larry spoke about Japan, right? Japan's debt to GDP is almost 300%, but a lot of it is owned by its locals and its pension funds, right? So of course we don't ever want to get there, but and nonetheless, the government has for a long time crowded out a lot of borrowing, right? So because if you look now, government borrows money just about every month or issues bonds, right? And then that caused some level of complacement where persons, you don't need to look for anything else. You could just buy government bonds. But if there are alternatives, people will invest in the alternatives, and that will be more so in the private sector. And I'll kind of cover as well some of, like the recent projects we've done where persons have been able to diversify away from government bonds. You don't want any plan where everything is, government securities.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is the debt is allocated, I think about 4 billion, which is about 40+% of that is foreign currency, and the other portion is local currency. And the challenge with the foreign side is we have to raise foreign currency in order to service it. So we become challenged. And what we have been doing a lot in recent years, which is why the foreign component of that debt is so high, is we have been borrowing money to service that debt, and that makes it very challenging. And yes, there are a number of pension plans that hold those debt, but a lot of our institutional clients are asking us not to take on more government debt. And so government is challenged in a lot of ways with raising funds, particularly locally, because they are concerned. Particularly those ones that have a head office away from the Bahamas, they are saying, okay, we are concerned about this level of debt, so we want you to hold off in investing too much in government bonds.
Two more? Okay.
Okay.
Well, let's give it up for CFAL Talks team.
That's okay, that's fine.